Hello, my name is Banu Kampati, and I am a sophomore right now at the University of Pittsburgh. I am majoring in biology and chemistry. I'm double majoring in that. And today I'm here to read you a book called Ancient and Modern Ships. Uh, so this is part one of a three-part series, I believe. And this book I used to read when I was little quite a bit because I was really interested in ships and sailing ships. So with that, let us begin. So this is chapter one, the introduction. A museum relating to naval architecture and shipbuilding is of the utmost interest to the people of Great Britain, on account of the importance to them of everything that bears on the carrying of their commerce. Every Englishman knows, in a general way, that the commerce of the British Empire is more extensive than that of any other state in the world, and that the British sea-going mercantile marine compares favourably in point of size even with that of all the other countries of the world put together. But few are probably aware of the immense importance to us of those fleets of trading ships, of the great part which they play in the maintenance of the prosperity of these isles. The shipping industry ranks, after agriculture, as the largest of our national commercial pursuits. There is more capital locked up in it, and more hands are employed in the navigation and construction of ships, their engines and fittings, than in any other trade of the country excepting the tillage of the soil. The following table gives the relative figures of the merchant navies of the principal states of the civilized world in the year 1898, and proves at a glance the immense interest to our fellow countrymen of all that affects the technical advancement of the various industries connected with shipping. So basically, this table shows that the United Kingdom has the greatest number of steam and sailing ships, and it shows a total tonnage of the steam and sailing vessels as a net total. And the United Kingdom is the largest, followed by the United States of America. The part played by technical improvements and the maintenance of our present position cannot be overestimated, for that position, such as it is not due to any inherent permanent advantage possessed by this country. Time was when our mercantile marine was severely threatened by competition from foreign states. To quote the most recent example, about the middle of last century, the United States of America fought a well-contested struggle with us for the carrying trade of the world. Shortly after the abolition of the navigation laws, the competition was very severe, and the United States ships had obtained almost exclusive possession of the China trade and of the trade between Europe and North America, and in the year 1850 the total tonnage of the shipping of the States was 3,535,434 against 4,232,960 tons owned by Great Britain. The extraordinary progress in American mercantile shipbuilding was due in part to special circumstances connected with their navigation laws, and in part to the abundance and cheapness of excellent timber. But even with these advantages, the Americans would never have been able to run such a close race with us for the carrying trade of the world, had it not been for the great technical skill and intelligence of their shipbuilders, who produced vessels which were the envy and admiration of our own constructors. As a proof of this statement, it may be mentioned that the labor-saving mechanical contrivances adopted by the Americans were such that on board their famous liners and clippers 20 men could do the work which in a British ship of equal size required 30. In addition to this advantage, the American vessels could sail faster and carry more cargo in proportion to their registered tonnage than our own vessels. It was not till new life was infused into British naval architecture that we were enabled to conquer the American competition. And then it was only by producing still better examples of the very class of ship which the Americans had been the means of introducing that we were eventually enabled to wrest from them the China trade. Another triumph in the domain of technical shipbuilding, viz. the introduction and successful development of the iron screw merchant steamer, eventually secured for the people of this country that dominion of the seas which remains with them to this day. Among the great means of advancing technical improvements, none takes higher rank than a good educational museum, for it enables a student to learn, as he otherwise cannot learn, the general course which improvements have taken since the earliest times, and hence to appreciate the direction which progress will inevitably take in the future. Here he will learn, for instance, how difficulties have been overcome in the past, and will be better prepared to play his part in overcoming those with which he in his turn will be confronted. In such a museum he can study the advantages conferred upon the owner by the successive changes which have been effected in the materials, construction, and the means of propulsion of ships. He can trace, for instance, the effects of the change from wood to iron and from iron to steel in the carrying capacity of ships, and he can note the effects of successive improvements in the propelling machinery, in saving weight and space occupied by engines, boilers, and bunkers, and in conferring upon a ship of a given size the power of making longer voyages. Here, too, he can learn how it was that the American clipper supplanted the old English sailing merchantman, and how the screw iron ship, fitted with highly economical engines, has practically driven the clipper from the seas. In fact, with the aid of a good museum, the student is enabled to take a bird's-eye view of the whole chain of progress, in which the existing state of things constitutes but a link. Signs are not wanting that the competition with which British shipowners had to contend in the past will again become active in the near future. The advantages conferred upon us by abundant supplies of iron and by cheap labor will not last forever. There are many who expect, not without reason, that the abolition or even the diminution of protection in the United States will, when it comes to pass, have the same stimulating effect upon the American shipbuilding industry which the abolition of the old navigation laws had upon our own, and when that day comes, Englishmen will find it an advantage to be able to enter the contest equipped with the best attainable technical education and experience. Chapter 2. Ancient Ships in the Mediterranean and Red Seas. It is not difficult to imagine how mankind first conceived the idea of making use of floating structures to enable him to traverse stretches of water. The trunk of a tree floating down a river may have given him his first notions. He would not be long in discovering that the tree could support more than its own weight without sinking. From the single trunk to a raft formed of several stems lashed together, the step would not be a long one. Similarly, once it was noticed that a trunk or log could carry more than its own weight and float, the idea would naturally soon occur to anyone to diminish the inherent weight of the log by hollowing it out and thus increasing its carrying capacity. The subsequent improvements of shaping the underwater portion so as to make the elementary boat handy and to diminish its resistance in the water, and of fitting up the interior so as to give facilities for navigating the vessel and for accommodating in it human beings and goods, would all come by degrees with experience. Even to the present day, beautiful specimens exist of such boats or canoes, admirably formed out of hollowed-out tree trunks. They are made by many uncivilized peoples, such as the islanders of the Pacific, and some of the tribes of Central Africa. Probably the earliest type of built-up boat was made by stretching skins on a frame. To this class belonged the coracle of the ancient Britons, which is even now in common use on the Atlantic seaboard of Ireland. The transition from a raft to a flat-bottomed boat was a very obvious improvement, and such vessels were probably the immediate forerunners of ships. It is usual to refer to Noah's Ark as the oldest ship of which there is any authentic record. Since, however, Egypt has been systematically explored, pictures of vessels have been discovered immensely older than the Ark. That is to say, if the date usually assigned to the latter, 2840 BC, can be accepted as approximately correct. And as we shall see hereafter, there are vessels now in existence in Egypt which were built about this very period. The Ark was a vessel of such enormous size that the mere fact that it was constructed argues of very advanced knowledge and experience on the part of contemporaries of Noah. Its dimensions were, according to the biblical version, reckoning the cubit at 18 inches, length 450 feet, breadth 75 feet, and in depth 45 feet. If very full in form, its registered tonnage would have nearly been 15,000. According to the earlier Babylonian version, the depth was equal to the breadth, but unfortunately, the figures of the measurement were not legible. It has been sometimes suggested that the Ark was a huge raft with a superstructure or house built on it, of dimensions given above. There does not, however, appear to be the slightest reason for concurring with this suggestion. On the contrary, the biblical account of the structure of the Ark is so detailed that we have no right to suppose that the description of the most important part of it, the supposed raft to which its power of floating would have been due, would have been omitted. Moreover, the whole account reads like the description of a ship-shaped structure. Shipbuilding in Egypt. The earliest information on the building of ships is found, as might have expected, on the Egyptian tombs and monuments. It is probable that the valley of the Nile was also the first land bordering on the Mediterranean in which ships, as distinguished from a more elementary craft, were constructed. Everything is in favor of such a supposition. In the first place, the country was admirably situated, geographically, for the encouragement of the art of navigation, having seaboards on two important inland seas, which commanded the commerce of Europe and Asia. The next place, the habitable portion of Egypt, consisted of a long narrow strip of densely peopled, fertile territory, bordering a great navigable river, which formed a magnificent highway throughout the whole extent of the country. It is impossible to conceive of the physical circumstances more conducive to the discovery and development of the arts of building and navigating floating structures. Experience gained on the safe waters of the Nile would be the best preparation for taking the bolder step of venturing on the open seas. The character of the two inland seas which form the northern and eastern frontiers of Egypt was such as to favor, to the greatest extent, the spirit of adventure. As a rule, their waters are relatively calm, and the distances to be traversed to reach other lands are inconsiderable. We know that the ancient Egyptians, at a period which the most modern authorities place at about 7,000 years ago, had already attained to a very remarkable degree of civilization and to a knowledge of the arts of construction on land which has never since been excelled. What is more natural than to suppose that the genius and science which enabled them to build the pyramids and their vast temples and palaces, to construct huge works for the regulation of the Nile, and to quarry, work into shape, and move into place blocks of granite weighing in some cases several hundreds of tons, should also lead them to excel in the art of building ships? Not only the physical circumstances, but the habits and the religion of the people created a demand, even a necessity, for the existence of navigable floating structures. At the head of the delta of the Nile was the ancient capital, the famous city of Memphis, near to which were built the pyramids as tombs in which might be preserved inviolate, until the day of resurrection, the embalmed bodies of their kings. The roofs of the burial chambers in the heart of the pyramids were prevented from falling in, under the great weight of the superincumbent mass, by huge blocks or beams of the hardest granite, meeting at an angle above the chambers. The long galleries by which the chambers were approached were closed after the burial by enormous gates consisting of blocks of granite, which were let down from above, sliding in grooves like the portcullis of a feudal castle. In this way it was hoped to preserve the corpse contained in the chamber absolutely inviolate. The huge blocks of granite, which weighed from 50 to 60 tons each, were supposed to be too heavy ever to be moved again after they had been lowered into position, and they were so hard that it was believed they could never be pierced. Now, even if we had no other evidence to guide us, the existence of these blocks of granite in the pyramids would afford the strongest presumption that the Egyptians of that remote time were perfectly familiar with the arts of inland navigation, for the stone was quarried at Aswan, close to the First Cataract, 583 miles above Cairo, and could have only been conveyed from the quarry to the building site by water. In the neighborhood of Memphis are hundreds of other blocks of granite from Aswan, many of them of enormous size. The pyramid of Menkaure, or Mycerinus, built about 3633 BC, was once entirely encased with blocks from Aswan. The temple of the Sphinx, built at a still earlier date, was formed, to a large extent, of huge pieces of the same material, each measuring 15 by 5 by 3 by 2 feet and weighing about 18 tons. The mausoleum of the sacred bulls at Saqqara contains numbers of Aswan granite sarcophagi, some of which measure 13 by 8 by 11 feet. These are but a few instances out of the many existing from which we may infer that even so far back as the 4th dynasty the Egyptians made use of the arts of inland navigation. We are, however, fortunately not obliged to rely on inference, for we have direct evidence from the sculptures and records on the ancient tombs. Thanks to these, we now know that the ancient Nile boats were like, and how they were propelled, and what means were adopted for transporting the huge masses of building material which were used in the construction of the temples and monuments. The art of reading the hieroglyphic inscriptions was first discovered about the year 1820, and the exploration of the tombs and monuments has only been since prosecuted systematically during the last 25 years. Most of the knowledge of ancient Egyptian ships has, therefore, been acquired in quite recent times, and much of it only during the last year or two. This is the reason why, in the old works on shipbuilding, no information is given on this most interesting subject. Knowledge is, however, now being increased every day, and thanks to the practice of the ancient Egyptians of recording their achievements in sculpture in a material which is imperishable in a dry climate, we possess at the present day probably a more accurate knowledge of their ships than we do of any other ancient or medieval people. By far, the oldest boats of which anything is now known were built in Egypt by the people who inhabited that country before the advent of the pyramid builders. It is only within the last few years that these tombs have been explored and critically examined. They are now supposed to be of Libyan origin and to date from between 5000 and 6000 BC. In many of these tombs, vases of pottery have been discovered, on which are painted rude representations of ships. Some of the latter were of remarkable size and character. Figure 2 is taken from one of these vases. It is a river scene, showing 2 boats in procession. The pyramid-shaped mounds in the background represent a row of hills. These boats are evidently of very large size. One of them has 58 oars, or more probably paddles, on each side, and 2 large cabins amidships connected by a flying bridge, and with spaces fenced off from the body of the vessel. The steering was apparently effected by means of 3 large paddles on each side, and from the prow of one of the boats hangs a large weight, which was probably intended for an anchor. It will be noticed that the 2 ends of the vessels, like the Nile boats of the Egyptians proper, were not waterborne. A great many representations of these boats have now been discovered. They all have the same leading characteristics, though they differ very much in size. Amongst other peculiarities, they invariably have an object at the prow, resembling two branches of palm issuing from a stalk, also a mast carrying an ensign at the after cabin. Some explorers are of opinion that these illustrations do not represent boats, but fortifications or stockades of some sort. If we relied only on the rude representations painted on the vases, the question might be a moot one. It has, however, been definitely set at rest by Professor Flinders Petrie, who in the year 1899 brought back from Egypt very large drawings of the same character, taken not from vases, but from the tombs themselves. The drawings clearly show that the objects are boats and that they were apparently very shallow and flat-bottomed. It is considered probable that they were employed in an oversea trade as well as for Nile traffic. For in some of the tombs were found specimens of pottery of foreign manufacturers, some of which have been traced to Bosnia. The most ancient mention of a ship in the world's history is to be found in the name of the 8th king of Egypt after Mena, the founder of the royal race. This king, who was at the head of the second dynasty, was called Botos in Greek, which word signifies the prow of the ship. 19 kings intervened between him and Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid at Giza. The date of this pyramid is given by various authorities as from about 4,235 to 3,500 BC. As the knowledge of Egyptology increases, the date is set further and further back, and the late Marriott Pasha, who was one of the greatest authorities on the subject, fixed it at 4,235 BC. About 5 centuries intervened between the reign of Beto and the date of the Great Pyramid. Hence we can infer that ships were known to be Egyptians of the dynasties 67 centuries ago. Fortunately, however, we are not only obliged to rely on inferences drawn from the name of an individual. We actually possess pictures of vessels, which there is every reason to believe were built before the date of the Great Pyramid. The boat, represented by Figure 3, is of great interest, as it is by far the oldest specimen of a true Egyptian boat that has yet been discovered. It was copied by the late Mr. Villiers Stuart from the tomb of Kakon Q, situated in the side of a mountain near Kwa el Kabir, on the right bank of the Nile, about 279 miles above Cairo. The tomb belongs to a very remote period. From a study of the hieroglyphs, names of the persons, the forms of the pottery found, and the shape, arrangement, and the decoration of the tomb, Mr. Villiers Stuart came to the conclusion that it dates from the 3rd dynasty, and that consequently it is older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. If these conclusions are correct, and if Marriott's date for the Great Pyramid be accepted, Figure 3 represents a Nile boat as used about 6,300 years ago. That is to say, 15 centuries before the date commonly accepted for the Ark. Mr. Villiers Stuart supposes that it was a dugout canoe, but from the dimensions of the boat, this theory is hardly tenable. It will be noted that there are 7 paddlers on each side, in addition to a man using a sounding, or also punt pole at the prow, and 3 men steering with paddles in the stern. While amidships there is considerable free space occupied only by the owner, who is armed with the whip or courbash. The paddlers occupy almost exactly 1/2 of the total length, and from the space required for each of them, the boat must have been quite around 56 feet long. It could hardly have been less than 7 feet wide, as it contained a central cabin with sufficient space on either side of the ladder for paddlers to sit. If it were a dugout, the tree from which it was made must have been brought down the river from tropical Africa. There is no reason, however, to suppose anything of the sort, for if the epoch produced workmen skillful enough to excavate and decorate the tomb and to carve the statues and make the pottery which it contained, it must have also produced men quite capable of building up a boat from planks. The use of sails was also understood at this remote epoch. for it will be noticed that on the roof of the cabin is lying a mast which has been unshipped. The mast is triangular in shape, consisting of 2 spars joined together at the top at an acute angle, and braced together lower down. This form was probably adopted in order to dispense with stays and thus facilitate shipping and unshipping. It is also worthy of note that this boat appears to have been decked over, as the feet of all those on board are visible above the gunwale. A representation of a very similar boat we found in the tomb of Merab, a son of Khufu of the 4th Dynasty. The tombs of Egypt abound in pictures of boats and larger vessels, and many wooden models of them have also been found in the sarcophagi. There is in the Berlin Museum a model of a boat, similar in general arrangement to the one just described. It is decked over and provided with a cabin amidships, which does not occupy the full width of the vessel. Figure 4 is a vessel of later date and larger size than that found in the tomb of Ka-Ku, but its general characteristics are similar. From the number of paddlers, it must have been at least 100 feet in length. In this case, we see the mast is erected and a square sail set. The bow and stern also come off much higher out of the water, and a square sail. The bow and stern also come out much higher out of the water. The roof of the cabin is prolonged aft, so as to form a shelter for the steersman and a seat for the man holding the ropes. Similarly, it is prolonged forward, so as to provide a shelter for the captain or owner. This method of steering with oars continued in use for centuries, but in later and larger vessels, the steering oars, which were of great size, were worked by a mechanical arrangement. The illustration was taken originally from a 4th Dynasty tomb at Komel Amars. There are also extant pictures of Egyptian cattle boats formed of 2 ordinary barges lashed together with a temporary house or cattle shed constructed across them. The history of Egypt, as inscribed in hieroglyphs on the ancient monuments, relates many instances of huge sarcophagi, statues, and obelisks having been brought down the Nile on ships. The tombs and monuments of the 6th Dynasty are particularly rich in such records. In the tomb of Unam, who was a high officer under the 3 kings, Ati, Pepi I, and Meron-Ra, are inscriptions which shed a flood of light on Egyptian shipbuilding of this period, and on the uses to which ships were put. In one of them, we learn Una was sent by Pepi to quarry a sarcophagus in a single piece of limestone in the mountain of Jura, opposite to Memphis, and to transport it, together with other stones, in one of the king's ships. In another, it is related how he headed a military expedition against the land of Zareba, to the north of the land of the Harusha, and how the army was embarked in ships. In the reign of Pepi's successor, Meron-Ra, Una appears to have been charged with quarrying and transport of the stones destined for the king's pyramid, his sarcophagus, statue, and other purposes. The following passage from the inscriptions on his tomb gives even the number of ships and rafts with which he employed on this work. His Holiness, the King Meron-Ra, sent me to the country of Abat to bring back a sarcophagus with its cover, also a small pyramid and a statue of the King Meron-Ra, whose pyramid is called Ka-Nothar, the Beautiful Rising. And His Holiness sent me to the city of Elephantine to bring back a holy shrine with its base of hard granite and the doorposts and cornices of the same granite, and also to bring back the granite posts and thresholds for the temple opposite to the pyramid Ka-Nothar of King Meron-Ra. The number of ships destined for the complete transport of all these stones consisted of 6 broad vessels, 3 towboats, 3 rafts, and one ship manned with warriors. Further on, the inscriptions relate how stone for the pyramid was hewn in the granite quarries at Aswan, and how rafts were constructed 60 cubits in length and 30 cubits in breadth to transport the material. The royal Egyptian cubit was 20.67 inches in length, and the common cubit is 18.24 inches. The river had fallen to such an extent that it was not possible to make use of these rafts, and others of a smaller size had to be constructed. For this purpose, Una was dispatched up the river to the country of Wawati, which Brugsch considered to be modern Korosko. The inscription states, "His Holiness sent me to cut down 4 forests in the south in order to build 3 large vessels and 4 towing vessels out of the acacia wood in the country of Wawati. And behold, the officials of Ararat and Mata caused the wood to be cut down for this purpose. I executed all this in the space of a year. As soon as the waters rose, I loaded the rafts with immense pieces of granite for the pyramid conifer of the king Meron Ra." Mr. Vilius Stuart found several pieces of large ships of this remote period at Kars el Sayad on the Nile, about 70 miles below Thebes, and the tomb of Ptah-hotep, who lived in the reigns of Pepi I and his 2 successors. These boats were manned with 24 rowers and had 2 cabins, one amidships and the other astern. The same explorer describes the contents of a tomb of the 6th dynasty at Gebel Abu Faida, on the walls of which he observed the painting of a boat with a triple mast, presumably made of 3 spars arranged like the edges of a triangular pyramid, and a stern projecting beneath the water. Between the 6th and 11th dynasties, Egyptian history is almost an utter blank. The monuments contain no records for a period of about 600 years. We are therefore in complete ignorance of the progress of shipbuilding during this epoch. It was, however, probably considerable, for when next the monuments speak it is to give an account of mercantile expedition on the high seas. In the valley of Hammamat, near Koptos, about 420 miles above Cairo, is an inscription on the rocks, dating from the reign of Sankara, the last king of the 11th dynasty, about 2800 BC, describing an expedition by sea to the famous land of Punt on the coast of the Red Sea. This expedition is not to be confounded with another, a much more famous one, to the same land, carried out by direction of Queen Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty, about 11 centuries later. Sankara's enterprise is, however, remarkable as being the first overseas maritime expedition recorded in the world's history. It may be noted that it took place at about the date usually assigned to Noah's Ark. The town of Koptos was of considerable commercial importance, having been at one end of the great desert route from the Nile to the Red Sea port of Qasr, whence most of the Egyptian maritime expeditions started. The land of Punt, which was the objective of the expedition, is now considered to be identical with Somaliland. The following extracts from the inscription gives an excellent idea of the objects and conduct of the expedition, which was under the leadership of a noble named Hanu, who is himself the author of the inscription. I was sent to conduct ships to the land of Punt to fetch for Pharaoh sweet-smelling spices, which the princes of the Red Land collected out of fear and dread, such as he inspires in all nations. As I started from the city of Koptos, and His Holiness gave the command that the armed men who were to accompany me should be from the south country of the Thebaid. After describing the arrangements which he made for watering the expedition along the desert route, he goes on to say that I arrived at the port of Seba, and I had ships of Burten built to bring back products of all kinds, and I offered a great sacrifice of oxen, cows, and goats. When I returned from Seba, I had executed the king's command, for I brought him back all kinds of products which I had met with in the ports of the Holy Land, Punt. And I came back by the roads of Owak and Rohan, and brought with me precious stones for the statues of the temples. But such a thing never happened since there were kings, nor was the like of it ever done by any blood relations who were sent to these places since the time of the sun god, Ra. From the last sentence of the above quotation, we may infer that previous expeditions have been sent to the land of Punt. Communications with this region must, however, have been carried on only at considerable intervals, for we read that Hanu had to build the ships required for the voyage. Unfortunately, no representations of these vessels accompany the inscription. Between the end of the 11th and the commencement of the 18th dynasty, the monuments gave us very little information about ships or maritime expeditions. Ahmes, the first king of the later dynasty, freed Egypt from the domination of the Shepherd Kings by means of a naval expedition on the Nile and the Mediterranean. A short history of this campaign is given in the tomb of another Ahmes near Al-Kab, a place on the east bank of the river, 502 miles south of Cairo. This Ahmes was a captain of sailors who served under Sequenen Ra, King Ahmes, Amenephis, and Thutmose I. King Ahmes is supposed to have been the pharaoh of the Old Testament who knew not Joseph. He lived about 1700 BC. By far, the most interesting naval records of this dynasty are the accounts in the temple of Dur el-Bahari, close to Thebes, of the famous expedition to the land of Punt, carried out by order of that remarkable queen, Hatshepsut, who was a daughter of Thutmose I, half-sister and wife of Thutmose II, and aunt and stepmother of the famous king Thutmose III. She appears to have been called by her father during his lifetime to share the throne with him, and to have practically usurped the government during the reign of her husband and during the early years of the reign of her nephew. The expedition to the land of Punt was evidently one of the most remarkable events of her reign. It took place about 1600 BC, that is to say, about 3 centuries before the Exodus. The history of the undertaking is given at great length on the retaining wall of one of the terraces of the temple, and the various scenes and events are illustrated by carvings on the same wall in as complete a manner as though the expedition had taken place in the present time, and had been accompanied by the artists of one of our pictorial newspapers. Fortunately, the great bulk of the carvings and inscriptions remain to this day, and we possess therefore a unique record of a trading expedition carried out at this remote period. The carvings comprise representations of the ships going out, the landings at the Incense Terrace Mountain, and the meeting with the princes and people of this strange land are also shown. We have pictures of their pile dwellings and of the trees and animals of the country, and also portraits of the king of Punt, of his wife and children. Lastly, we have representations of the ships returning to Egypt, laden with the precious incense of the land and with other merchandise, and also the triumphant reception of the members of the expedition at Thebes. One of the inscriptions relates as follows: "The ships were laden to the uttermost with the wonderful products of the land of Punt, with the different precious woods of the divine land, and with heaps of the resin of incense, with fresh incense trees, with ebony, objects of ivory set in pure gold from the land of the Amu, with sweet woods, kesset wood, with aham incense, holy resin, and paint for the eyes, with dog-headed apes, with long-tailed monkeys and greyhounds, with leopard skins, and with the natives of the country, together with their children. Never was the like brought to any king of Egypt since the world stands." The boast contained in the concluding sentence was obviously not justified, as we now know the same claims were made in the inscription in the valley of Hamat, describing the previous expedition to Punt, which took place 11 centuries earlier. From the front piece, figure 1, we can form an accurate idea of the ship used in the Red Sea trade in the time of the 18th dynasty. They were propelled by rowers instead of by paddlers. As in all the previous examples, there were 15 rowers on each side, allowing 4 feet for the distance between each seat, and taking account of the length of the overhanging portion at bow and stern. The length of each vessel could have been little short of 100 feet. They were apparently decked over and provided with raised cabins at the 2 extremities. The projections marked along the sides may indicate the ends of beams, or they may, as some writers have supposed, have been pieces of timber against which oars could have been worked in narrow and shallow water. The vessels were each rigged with a huge square sail, The spars carrying the sails were as long as the boats themselves and were each formed of 2 pieces spliced together in the middle. The stems and sterns were not waterborne. In order to prevent the vessel from hogging under the influence of the weights of the unsupported ends, a truss was employed, similar in principle and object to those used to this day in American river steamers. The truss was formed by erecting 4 or more pillars in the body of the vessel, terminating at a height of about 6 feet above the gunwale, and crutches. A strong rope running fore and aft was passed over these crutches and also around the mast, at the ends of the rope having been arranged as to gird and support the stem and stern respectively. Alright guys, we'll conclude this chapter later. Alright, thank you for listening.